Okay, so chapter 9, it's about muscular system. So we're going to have the introduction for the muscular system, which includes explaining how the muscular fibers organize, how we name the muscles based on action, appearance, and location. Also, we're going to summarize the function of the skeletal muscles. We're going to see some terms that are used for the action of these muscles, like agonist, antagonist, synergist, etc. And we're going to see how muscles help us to perform movements with less effort. So we will see the classification of levers, which is a physical device that help us to produce movement, carrying weight without doing so much effort. And then we're going to start naming muscles of the head, neck, and vertebral column. As well, we're going to continue with the rest of the muscles and demonstrate some actions. So as an introduction, so basically our muscles are organs that help us to perform motion or movement. And that movement takes action at joints. So the muscles crosses the joints, so they insert in a proximal for the ones that are located, of course, in the appendicular skeleton. So they cross the joints by having insertion in a proximal bone and going and inserting into the distal bone. And the muscles helps to produce a smooth motion for the most part, and it is controlled. Sometimes people can have diseases in which they have discontrol of these movements, so they produce gross movements, like in Parkinson's or in Huntington's disease. And this is related to poor performance of the nerves that help us to control this motion. Now, the muscles have 2 points of insertion. One that is called origin, which is typically located in a proximal location, and then they have an insertion that is located distally, with few exceptions. We will see which ones are those exceptions. Now, the origin is fixed, the insertion is movable. Okay? And then the muscles generate not only body movement, but heat with the contraction. So, contraction of muscle produces movements of bones. And when these bones are articulated for the muscles that are inserted in bones, because not all the muscles insert in bones, some inserts in the dermis in our skin. But for those ones that are inserted in bones, they move this articulation, and then we can produce the movement. Now, another function of the muscles is to help us to maintain posture. We have our back muscles that are constantly contracting so that we can stand still. And then they stabilize joints. Of course, we can produce movements when we contract our muscles, but we have in human behavior certain movements that we have to perform. For instance, when someone is playing an instrument or when someone is doing sports, they have to control that movement of the articulations. So then our muscles help us to stabilize joints. And then they generate heat. We have our muscles that has receptors for a hormone that is called thyroid hormone that increases the metabolism of the cells in our body. And through this metabolism, we generate heat. And that heat is important for driving chemical reactions in our body. Our muscles cells contains glycogen, which is glucose stored. And when we run out of glucose in our blood because we have starving for a certain amount of time, then our muscles uses this glycogen, it breaks it down, it contracts, and then we generate heat so that we can maintain the body heat. And It helps to support soft tissues, like the muscles of the pelvic floor. It helps to support all these pelvic floor organs, like the urinary bladder, ovaries, uterus, etc. And as well, it helps to control openings. We have sphincters, circular layers of muscles that help us to open and close these openings. And one example will be this muscle that we have around our oral cavity, our mouth, that is called orbicularis oris. If you close it, nothing comes in, okay? And then you open it, and then you can ingest your food. The cells of the muscle are called fibers. So that's what we call it, fibers, muscular fibers, or plainly fibers. And then these fibers have proteins. They have actin and myosin. And these proteins are called myofilaments. Myo for muscle. And then these proteins are contractile, so they can shorten and then they can slide over each other. And the muscle fibers are protected by connective tissue, a membrane of connective tissue, the individual fibers that we call endomysium. Endo for inside, mysium for muscle. And this endomysium surrounds these individual fibers, and several fibers, around 10 to 100, forms a fascicle. And this fascicle, it is surrounded by connective tissue, a membrane that we call perimysium. Peri means around, and mysium muscle. Now, several fascicles, depending on the muscle, how many fascicles it will have, but several fascicles will form a complete muscle. And this complete muscle is surrounded by connective tissue, a membrane that we call epimysium. Epi means above the muscle. So that's the structural organization of muscles. So we have myofibrils at the cellular level. They form a muscle fiber. That muscle fiber will be surrounded by an endomysium, and then muscle fibers form a fascicle, and then the fascicle forms a muscle, or several fascicles forms muscle. So then this one is surrounded by endomysium. So this is how then you form a muscle. Myofibril forms a fiber, fibers form fascicles, fascicles form a muscle. And then these are the membranes that surrounds each of these. Now the epimysium itself, the outer layer of the muscle, will merge with tendons. Tendons, if you remember, is dense, regular connective tissue. And these tendons will be the ones that fuses to the periosteum so that you can have an insertion of this muscle into the bone. something for sure is that our skeletal muscles receive a lot of blood supply. And they have a lot of mitochondria because they have to generate a lot of ATP, and ATP is necessary for contraction of this muscle. Now, our muscle fibers are under voluntary control for the most part. Unless you're a poker player, you can control the movement of your muscles of the face pretty well, but sometimes our emotion shows no matter what through our facial expression. But for the rest of the muscles, guys, we typically control it, with voluntary control, which explains then why poker players, they don't show what cards they have, right? They control really well their muscles of facial expression. So then they are part of the voluntary control. Now, our muscles are connected by nerves, the neurons within these nerves. And with this connection, we form a neuromuscular junction. And within this neuromuscular junction, we have chemical signals sent from the nerve into the muscle. So we have chemical signals driven from the nerve into this muscle so that we can perform the function of the muscle, which will be contraction. So we will study that in greater detail. We will see how we have neurotransmission between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. So then we have closed cell-cell communication between muscle cells and neurons. Here are some examples of the gross anatomy of the skeletal muscle. So here we have, or a diagram showing you what makes this muscle. So here we have a complete muscle. This will be the biceps brachii that we have in the anterior part of our arm. It is connected to the humerus by this tendon, and this will be the epimysium that surrounds all of these fascicles. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 fascicles. If you extend one of these fascicles, the fascicles will be protected by this perimysium, and then inside these fascicles you have multiple fibers, which here we have telescoped out one. So this is a muscular fiber that it is protected by an endomysium. So fascicles then are made from 10 to 100 muscular fibers, and then the muscular fibers within fascicles are arranged in a particular way. And that arrangement can be named. So, for instance, if the fibers in the fascicle runs parallel to each other, you call it parallel. It looks like a strap. They run sideways. So those are parallel fascicles. If in the fascicles you have a broad origin with a taper end, like if the fibers starts broad and they go into a single point that looks like a triangle, that will be a convergent fascicle. If the fascicles arranged like if it was a feather, this fascicle will be called pennate. So you have a tendon in the center, and you can have fascicles arranging like a feather. So you can have it only on one side. In this case, will be unipennate. If you have it on both sides, will be bipennate, and multiple sides will be multipennate. If the fascicles run in a circular way, that will be called circular, that fascicle. And if the fascicle has taper ends and in the middle is bulky, that will be a fusiform fascicle. So those are the different types of fascicles that we can have. Parallel, convergent, circular, pennate, and fusiform. So here is the view of all of these arrangements for the fascicles. So the fibers in the fascicle runs next to each other, that's parallel. Starting broad, ending into a single point, that's convergent. It looks like a triangle. These are the different pennate types. This is the central tendon. Only on one side of the tendon, that will be unipennate. On both sides of the tendon, that will be bipennate. And then in multiple sides will be multipennate. Fascicle with the fibers arranging in circular motion will be circular. Taper ends, and then thick middle part, that will be fusiform. So here are the places where we have these type of arrangements. In the eye, we have circular, also in the mouth. Here we have multipennate in the deltoid muscle, the shoulder muscle. Here will be convergent in the pectoralis muscle. This will be fusiform and convergent. This will be unipennate in the flexor pollicis in the forearm. And then here we have parallel in this muscle that we have in the leg and the thigh that is called sartorius. And then bipennate in this part of the quadriceps muscle that is called the rectus femoris. So those are some examples of this arrangement. Any questions about the arrangement of the fibers? Okay, now naming muscles. So the muscles can be named based on size, location, action, and combination of any of these names. So for instance, for action, we have flexors, we have extensors, abductors, adductors, pronators, supinators. So that's how you name them, depending on what they do. How many times you have heard people being called not by their name, but by their title, what they do, like engineer, lawyer, doctor, nurse. Call them like that. Shape. If it looks like a triangle, like Greek letter delta, you call it deltoid. If it's round, it will be teres. And most of these names are Latin-based. Like a trapezoid, you call it trapezius. Location, if it's in the temple, in the temporalis area, temporal bone, that will be temporalis. In the abdomen, abdominis. In the arm, brachii. According to size, maximus, largest. Minimus, the smallest. Short, brevis, longus, long. Direction of the fibers. If it runs straight, you call it rectus. If it runs in an angle, you call it oblique. If it runs circular, you call it orbicularis. If it runs horizontally, you call it transverse. If it's deep, you call it internal. If it's out in the surface, you call it external. If it's very, very deep, you call it profundus. If it's superficial, superficialis. So there are different ways to name them, and then you can combine them. So that's general name for gross anatomy. Now, based on action, you can also classify your names. So a prime mover or agonist will be a muscle that is responsible for the primary movement that you intend. And typically, if you have a primary mover, you have another muscle that can oppose that movement. And a muscle that opposes the movement of the agonist is going to be called antagonist. So if you're flexing your elbow, your prime mover or your agonist is going to be the biceps brachii. And the one that is going to antagonize it by extending the elbow is going to be the triceps brachii. Now, the agonist sometimes can be the antagonist. Like, let's say that you want to extend the elbow. You're working out your triceps, you want to extend the elbow. In this case, your primary movement will be extension. And who's going to oppose it? The biceps. So you can switch roles. Now, we also have muscles that can help the agonist. And in this case, you call it a synergist. It reduces the amount of work that the agonists have to do by stabilizing the joints, preventing unwanted movements. Brachialis is a synergist for elbow flexion, so that the biceps don't have to do as much work. And then fixators are synergists as well, but in this case, they stabilize the origin of the agonist, and it works much better. So for instance, we have a tiny muscle here that's called anconeus. It's very tiny, but it fixes this joint when the triceps is extending the elbow, and the tricep doesn't have to do as much work. So that's a fixator. So here we have functional classification of muscles in this figure. So we have these muscles here in the arm and also here in the shoulder, the scapula. So this is the supraspinatus. Here is the biceps brachii. Here's the brachialis, and here's the triceps brachii. This person wants to have a sip of the drink, so he has to flex the elbow. In this case, that's the primary movement. So then you have to use your agonist, which is the biceps brachii, and the brachialis, which will be a synergist. They have it backwards, the names in there. And then your antagonist, once the person finishes drinking, then will be the triceps brachii, But the fixator, the one that helps us to flex better the elbow, is going to be the supraspinatus. Now, I already told you that the muscles have 2 points of attachment. One that is the origin, the other one that is insertion. The origin is typically proximal, and the insertion is distal. And no matter if it's distal or proximal, the origin is a fixed point of insertion, while the insertion, it is movable. So it's the point where the muscle produces movement. So some exceptions will be when muscles cross multiple joints. Like for instance, the iliopsoas that inserts in the femur, moving it to flex the hip like this. And it produces trunk flexion at the hip while the femur is fixed. And it has several points of origin in the vertebral column, in the lower lumbar vertebrae, so that we can have this acting as insertion when we do this movement. So we can do this with the iliopsoas, but also we can do this. So then, knowing this can help us to visualize when we will be seeing these origins and insertions, what is the movement that is going to be produced by the different muscles. So this is one example. So here we have the biceps brachii, and it has two heads, the long head and the short head. So here we have the origin of the biceps brachii in the coracoid process of the scapula and in the supraglenoid tubercle in the scapula. So it's close to this glenoid cavity and also here in the coracoid process. Now this muscle goes and inserts into the radial tuberosity, in the radius, and also in the ulna here. So with this muscle, when you have the origin fixed here, and then you contract your muscle, you're going to move the insertion, so that's where you're going to apply the force. So that will make this ulna and the radius to be pulled towards these bones in here. So the insertion is more mobile, so it's going to help us to then do this movement, flexion of the elbow. So it's moving the insertion towards the origin. Lever systems. So levers have parts. So lever system has parts. The lever itself, which in the case of our body will be the bone, will act as a bar or a lever in physics. And then in the lever system, you have a load, which will be, in the case of our body, the body part or resistance to be moved. Or it can be seen what you have to move, the load. The force will be the contraction that is needed to generate that movement. And a fulcrum will be the point that will be used to carry that load. In the case of our body, will be the joint. that acts as a pivot point. And then we have three classes of levers depending on the position of the fulcrum, the load, and the force. And we have first class, second class, and third class. And in the first class, the fulcrum is in the middle. In the second class, the load, and look at the letters that has been bolded, load, O-D, because they are found in this word, load. In second class, the load is in the middle, and in the third class, because it has an R, the force will be in the middle. So it's just kind of a way to think about what part is in the middle. So first class, you take into account the first letter of fulcrum, which is F, to keep it into account that it's in the middle. And then for the force will be also think about that this has an R, so this one has an R too, so this force is in the middle. And then for the second, which has OD, load has OD, that will be in the middle. So where do we have first, second, and third classes of levers? So in the atlanto-occipital joint, we have the fulcrum in the middle. So that will help us to carry the weight of our head, which is kind of heavy, by applying this force with the contraction of the trapezius muscle that we have here in the back, so that we can have our head not by gravity going down, but keeping it straight so that we don't fall. In the case of the second class where we have the load in the middle, it's like when you're standing in your toes. So basically, standing in your toes is your metatarsophalangeal joint. And when you have this type of second load, you can carry a large load with a small force. It gives you a mechanical advantage, having the load in the middle. In third class, like in our elbow, when you flex your elbow with your biceps brachii, you can help to carry the load, but it has a mechanical disadvantage. You sacrifice force for speed and range, so you don't have as much movement, and you are not as quick. So here are the examples. So here we have the atlanto-occipital joint. So it's first class because the fulcrum is here in the middle. That's the joint, the atlanto-occipital joint, between the occipital condyles of the occipital bone and the lateral masses of the atlas. The force will be contraction of your trapezius. And what is the load? The weight of your head. So we don't be all the way like this. So you contract your trapezius, you lift your head. So this can be compared as seesaw. So if the load, it is not as much, and you have here the force on one edge and the fulcrum here in the middle. When you apply the force, then the load goes up. Okay? Now, in the second class, so the load is in the middle. And then you have the fulcrum here. And then you have the force that will oppose the load. So this is like the most advantageous one to carry a heavy load, because you have the fulcrum here, and then you have all the force here, and then you can carry a big load, like all the weight of our body, just by standing in our toes with the metacarpal phalangeal joint. that acts as a fulcrum. Now, for the third class, which will be, in this case, the elbow joint, so we have the load here, for instance, in our hand, like carrying a dumbbell, and then here you have the force by contracting your biceps, and the fulcrum is here. So when you contract, you can carry the load, but you don't do it with so much speed, and also you have limited range of motion. So this is the third class, second, and first. Any questions? Okay, so now we can move into looking individual muscles. So, muscles of facial expression. Muscles of facial expression are located in the face, and they typically insert into the dermis of our skin. Most of them are innervated by cranial nerve number 7, which is facial nerve. It is there, but I'm going to write it down in here. Now, cranial nerve number 7 not only innervates the muscles of facial expression, also innervates glands like salivary glands, and innervates as well the tongue. So all of these muscles allow us to create facial expressions when they are innervated by this facial nerve. Sometimes some people may have damage to this facial nerve, and they won't be able to contract these muscles, and they will have what is called Bell's palsy or facial paralysis. So some of the actions include raising our eyebrows, like when you are surprised, closing our eyes, smiling, frowning, puckering our lips, tensing the neck, skin. So here are the list of these muscles of facial expression. Frontalis is part of a muscle that it has two heads. One in here that is called frontalis, and another one in here that is called occipitalis, that both connects by a membrane that is called gallia ponerotica. This muscle is called fronto-occipitalis or occipitofrontalis, or epicranial muscle. But this part that is the frontalis helps us to raise our eyebrows and wrinkling our forehead. Corrugator supercilii. It is located here between our eyes, above the dorsum of our nose. And if you are suspicious of someone, you will be doing this. So it draws the eyebrows medially and downward, frowning. Orbicularis oculi closes the eyelids, like winking. Levator labii superioris. Levator means elevating. Labii means lips. Superioris above is the upper lip. It brings the upper lip up. It's hard to move that one. And then we have these two very important muscles, zygomaticus minor and major. Those are the muscles of sincere smiling. It's not a smirking, it is a sincere smile. We all can tell right? So we're not dumb. We can tell when someone is sincere with us and smiles sincerely. It pulls the commissures of our lips up laterally, very broadly. So elevates the upper lip as well and the corner of our mouth. Now we have levator anguli oris that elevates the corner of the mouth. Buccinator, it's a muscle that here we have in the cheek area. It compresses the cheek. And that compression, it helps us to bring the food from the vestibule of our oral cavity, basically outside of our teeth, back, forces the food back into our teeth so that we can grind it. So that's the buccinator. Help us to whistle, blow. Rhizorius draws the corner of the mouth laterally. Oh, I like you so much. Mm-hmm. Fake smile. Orbicularis oris closes and protrudes the lips. Asking for a kiss. Depressor labii inferioris and depressor anguli oris. It draws the lower lip down and the corner of our mouth down too. So it makes us look sad, like pouting. Just as the mentalis. Mentalis protrudes the lower lip. Platysma, it's a muscle located here in the anterior neck area that tenses the skin of the neck. When someone is shaving, they do this. Cats have a bunch of platysma all over the dorsum. And when they're scared, the fur goes up. Because they're platysma. So it tenses the skin of the neck and depresses the mandible too. So here is the location then of all these muscles of facial expression. Frontalis, part of the frontoccipitalis. This is the gallia ponerotica or the epicranial aponerosis. Here we have the corrugator supercilii. Well, it's here. Actually, this. Orbicularis oculi. And then here we have levator labii superioris. Zygomaticus minor, Zygomaticus major, levator anguli oris, orbicularis oris, rhizorius. It's not shown in here, but we have the buccinator here. This is the mentalis. And then this is the depressor anguli oris and depressor labii inferioris and platysma. Most of these muscles, again, they are inserted into the dermis of our skin. That's why we cannot hide our emotions really easily. Now, then another exception for muscles that do not insert in bones, just like as our facial muscles that do not insert in bones, will be the muscles of the eye. The muscles of the eye inserts into the outer region of the eye, which is the sclera. So these muscles help to control the movement of our eyes precisely and help us to focus into object so that we can see with sharpness. So we have 4 rectuses, so 4 muscles that has fibers that run straight. And they're called based on in which area of the eye they insert. So if one inserts into the superior area of the eye, will be superior rectus. The other one, inferior rectus, inserts inferiorly. One inserts in the middle part of our eye, so that will be medial rectus, and the other one that inserts in the lateral part of our eye will be lateral rectus. So we have superior, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and lateral rectus. And then we have 2 obliques, superior oblique and inferior oblique. And they're called oblique because they run in an angle. Superior oblique, it is inserting into the superior lateral portion of our eye, and the inferior oblique in the inferior lateral portion of our eye. The actions are the following. Superior oblique help us to look up. Inferior oblique help us to look down. Rectuses, not oblique. Superior rectus help us to look up. Inferior rectus, look down. Lateral rectus to look to the sides. Medial rectus to look medially. So that's when we cross our eyes. And then superior rectus, that's the Sheater's muscle. Look down and out. Superior rectus. Inferior rectus is the opposite. It makes you look like if you were an intellectual, looking up and out. Oh, I'm philosophizing. Okay? And then for innervation. So we have 3 nerves, 3 cranial nerves that innervates the extrinsic eye muscles. So most of them are innervated by cranial nerve number 3. Cranial nerve number 3 is oculomotor. This one innervates or provides functions to each muscle in our eyes, with the exception of the lateral rectus and superior rectus. Superior oblique, sorry. And then we have cranial nerve 4, which is called trochlear nerve. That innervates the superior oblique. And then we have cranial nerve 6, which innervates and is called the abducens nerve, which innervates the lateral rectus. So then, let's say that someone has paralysis of cranial nerve number 6, because the person may have had a stroke or a damage in that area of the brain where you have the origin of the cranial nerve number 6. So then you don't have function of your lateral rectus muscle, right? Because that's the abducens. So how would your eyes deviate in that case? If you have paralysis of cranial nerve number 6, abducens. You are doing it right. If the lateral rectus muscle is paralyzed, where does the eye tend to go? Would you be able to abduce your eyes? No. So you won't be able to move your eyes laterally. So then your eye is going to tend to go medially, exactly. So it will be either bilaterally crossed eye or unilaterally crossed eye. Remedy is to perform a surgery that basically shortens the length of the lateral rectus to pull the eye back to the center. It's like a car, guys, out of alignment. If you release a little bit your steering wheel and it goes to one side, it's out of alignment. So here are the extrinsic eye muscles. So this is the sclera. This is the outer region of the eye. So here's the lateral rectus. This is the inferior oblique. This is the superior oblique. This is the superior rectus. This is the middle rectus and inferior rectus. And view anteriorly, so superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus, middle rectus. Superior oblique, inferior oblique. If this one becomes paralyzed, this muscle, because you have problems with cranial nerve number 6, of course this one has to have stronger force, so that will pull the eye medially and sometimes down. Now for muscles of mastication, they will be innervated by cranial nerve number 5, which is the trigeminal. And then branches of the trigeminal. Will be B1, B2, B3. So this is mandibular branch. Sorry, this is ophthalmic branch. B1 is ophthalmic. This will be maxillary. And this will be mandibular nerve. So, muscles of mastication are innervated by B3. That's where you had it there. CN B3, cranial nerve B3. So we have masseter, temporalis, medial, and lateral pterygoids. So, the only one that depresses the jaw will be the lateral pterygoid, but the rest closes the jaw. and protracts this one. The lateral pterygoid protracts the mandible. Basically does this. And also moves the jaw side to side to help us to grind. Medial, pterygoid, masseter, and temporalis all elevates the mandible. And this one, the temporalis, retracts it too. We do this. This masseter and the medial pterygoid protracts it, but also elevates the mandible. So then someone will have paralysis of B3 because he had a stroke, B3 get damaged. What do you expect in the person's jaw to happen? Can the person close the jaw really easily? No, maybe we'll be having an open jaw, very weak. One way to test clinically is by giving the person to bite in a tongue depressor, ask the person to bite it, and then the person who has a weak jaw because the muscles of mastication are not functioning properly because of paralysis of B3, you can take out the tongue depressor really easily. So here are the muscles of mastication. Temporalis, here located in this area, is removing here. Inserts into this temporalis line from the parietal, frontal, and then inserts here in the mandible, in the ramus. And then in here we have the masseter that inserts here in this portion, in the zygomatic and also temporal, and here in the mandibular angle. And then here we have the lateral pterygoid and the medial pterygoid that help us to produce this grinding motion. And this one help us to depress the jaw, while the rest, medial, pterygoid, temporalis, and masseter, closes the jaw. Any questions so far? Okay, now muscles that involves the movement of the neck and swallowing. So we have in the floor of our oral cavity the anterior belly of the digastric, and this one together with the posterior belly helps to elevate the hyoid bone and assist in opening the jaw. So the gastric helps us to open the jaw, and then the mylohyoid, which is forming the floor of our mouth, same as the digastric, elevates the hyoid and also elevates the tongue during swallowing. Swallow a little bit of saliva and you are using your mylohyoid, same as other muscles from the palate. Now, the stylohyoid elevates and retracts the hyoid. So anything that elevates the hyoid like digastric, mylohyoid, and stylohyoid, are what we call the suprahyoid muscles because they are located above. Supra means above the hyoid. And then we have the infrahyoid muscles that depresses the hyoid bone, like the sternohyoid. So this one connects the sternum to the hyoid bone, while this one, the styloid process of the temporal bone to the hyoid, and that's how it elevates it. This one connects the scapula to the hyoid bone, and it has, just as the digastric two bellies, a superior and inferior. This one depresses the hyoid and the larynx, the omohyoid. Thyrohyoid depresses the hyoid and elevates the larynx during swallowing. And sternothyroid depresses the thyroid cartilage. This one inserts in the sternum and goes to the thyroid cartilage. And then we have this powerful muscle on the sides of the neck that's called the sternocleidomastoid. The sternocleidomastoid helps us to rotate and flex our head. And it's an accessory muscle of respiration during forced breathing. So when you contract one of these sternocleidomastoids, the other one relaxes, and then you will have flexion, contralateral flexion of your muscle to the opposite side where you are contracting. And when you contract both, you can see straight ahead. So that elevates your head. So here are the location of these muscles that are involved in neck and neck movement and swallowing. So this is the mylohyoid. So here we have the central tendon. It inserts into the superior part of the body of the hyoid and then runs in an angle, inserting into the medial internal part of the body of the mandible. And then here is the anterior belly of the digastric. This is the posterior belly of the digastric. It passes through this little tendon to elevate the hyoid and flex the head. And then in here, this muscle between the thyroid cartilage, which is this, and the hyoid bone would be thyrohyoid. So this is an infrahyoid muscle, while these ones are suprahyoid muscles. And then this muscle that runs between the manubrium of the sternum and the hyoid bone will be sternohyoid. And this is the superior belly of the omohyoid. This is the inferior belly of the homohyoid. And for the sternocleidomastoid, it has two heads, one that runs between the sternum and the mastoid process, and one that runs between the clavicle and the mastoid process. So that's why it's called a sternocleidomastoid, taking the name for sternum, clavicle, and mastoid process. This is the one that helps us to extend our head or also flex it and laterally rotate it. And then this muscle that runs between the sternum and the thyroid cartilage will be a sternothyroid. Any questions? So these are superficial muscles, and you, of course, you remove the platysma, but there are some deeper muscles in there. So for pharyngeal muscles, so they are muscles located in the pharynx, and the pharynx is a muscular tube that helps us to bring the food from the oral cavity into the esophagus, which brings the food into the stomach. And then we have muscles also of the oral cavity. So muscles of the oral cavity that has the name glossus, they insert into the tongue. Styloglossus is a muscle that elevates the tongue and retracts the tongue. Hyoglossus depresses and retracts the tongue. Henioglossus protracts and retracts, protects and depresses the tongue. Now, all of these that end up in glossus are innervated by cranial nerve number 12. Which is hypoglossal nerve. Henioglossus and heniohyoid, they insert in the same area in the tubercles internal to the mandibular symphysis. Heniohyoid elevates the hyoid bone and widens the pharynx. Four constrictors of the pharynx. We have superior, middle, and inferior. They are innervated by vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. And vagus nerve innervates several muscles in the palate. So it helps us to swallow and produce speech. So stylopharyngeus elevates the pharynx during swallowing and speech, and then the buccinator, which we saw before, it compresses the cheek to help us to bring the food into the oral cavity. So here is the location of all of these muscles then. Here we have the hyoglossus runs between the hyoid bone and the tongue. This one will be the styloglossus because it runs from the stylo process to the tongue. This is the stylohyoid bone here, muscle. This is the stylopharyngeus because it runs from the stylo process to the pharynx, so it elevates the pharynx. And then here we have the thyrohyoid again, henihyoid in here, and henioglossus in here. So this one will depress the tongue while this one elevates the tongue. And then here's the buccinator, mylohyoid, heniohyoid again. And then here we have the constrictors of the pharynx, superior, middle, and inferior. And then here we have the esophagus. So these ones will open to receive the food and then close to bring the food down so that the food goes from superior part of the pharynx into inferior part of the pharynx. So we will see the next part on Thursday. Do you have any questions?